Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here. Today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about if people should be using loose form or strict form when it comes to isolation type movements if they're trying to gain as much muscle as possible. So let me put on my +5 out of weaponsmithing, work on skilling at my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. Now, some people are going to be like, Jason, you don't really believe in isolation. No, I don't. I really don't. I'm not saying it doesn't have its place, but it's not something I particularly promote. Because I think for most people it's not necessary. But I will state that for sport-specific reasons, in some cases for bringing up weak points in a situation to where a person's maximum recoverable volume has been hit on their big movements, there is a place for it. So I don't want people to think that I'm 100% against it and that I think it's always useless, because that's not the case. It's not necessarily true. There may be situations to where isolating a bicep or isolating the posterior head of your deltoid may actually be beneficial. It might even be warranted in your training programming. So the question we get into is, which one is better for hypertrophy? And the answer is going to be it depends. You always see that over in the bodybuilding world. They'll say silly stuff like, oh, you need to be strict in the mind-muscle connection and the pump and squeeze. None of that really matters. It doesn't matter. In fact, the data that did find that mind-muscle connection was superior to not focusing on anything also found that moving the weight with compensatory acceleration was even superior to mind-muscle connection for muscle fiber recruitment. So none of that stuff matters. But you will see a lot of people will say, well, they need to be really, really strict to make sure that you're hitting that muscle. That's not even true unless your form is so sloppy that you're not actually using the muscle through the full range of motion. In other words, when people cheat curl, for example, if they're curling to the point to where they're not even coming all the way down and they're cheating and they're swinging and everything and they're not even extending the arm to the bottom. In other words, when you see people whose cheat curls, they only come to here and they're doing like this, okay, that's not a curl. But if they're coming all the way down and back up and they're using some body English, you're still working the bicep, and people need to understand that when you have a joint that is involved and a muscle is part of that joint that moves that joint and it moves through the full range of motion, it doesn't matter if you're using other muscles, turning it into a compound movement, swinging, you are still working that muscle. Yes, you are lifting more weight, but you can't remove that muscle from the equation. Just like you can't take your triceps out of the bench press no matter how hard you try. You cannot remove the tricep as a primary mover. You can't remove the bicep from a curl. So when you start swinging and cheating and everything else, it doesn't mean you're not working it unless you are doing so and actually removing movement, like as far as joint angle goes. You're actually cheating so much that you're not even moving the muscle itself or the joint through the full range of motion, then you have a point. But that's not what we're talking about with looser form, right? That's not what we're talking about with just using a little bit of body English to move a heavier weight or turning it into a compound, such as if you curl further up to here. Right? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about people actually removing that from the range of motion, like removing part of the joint angle. And if you're cheating so much that you're doing that, then yeah, you are taking load off the muscle and you're not fully working the muscle. But as far as the other stuff goes, constant tension and any of that stuff, that's been shown to not really have any benefits. There's no value at all for hypertrophy for that. That's a bodybuilding myth. That's not based on reality, not based on human biomechanics. But there is an advantage to strict form, and it's not physiological. It's not physiological. It has to do with training, programming, and tracking. In other words, strict form on smaller exercises is the only way to judge your progression. In other words, progressive overload is everything. Without progressive overload, you're not stimulating muscle growth. So if you're getting on a really, really strict concentration curl or a machine curl, and you are progressively adding weight or adding reps with the same weight, you're able to do more volume or more work with the same weight, or you're able to add more weight over time, you have absolutely ensured hypertrophy of that muscle, right? Because you've increased the work that it's doing, and you know that you're doing it because that muscle is taking the brunt of the work. Now, you can't fully isolate a muscle even in a machine. It's not biologically possible. That's like, again, bodybuilding myths. You can't isolate muscles. But the closest you can come is something that's so strict that the muscle is always taking probably at least 90% of the load. And that's pretty well isolated. That pretty much requires a super strict movement to pull that off. So if you're doing something like that, then you can program for it. You can ensure progressive overload. And with progressive overload, you can actually test your performance more directly in a smaller muscle. In other words, on a bench press, just because your bench press goes up, you don't know which muscles have necessarily contributed, right? Because it's a multi-joint exercise, it's a big movement with a skill component. You don't know how much of your improvement is neuromuscular efficiency. You don't know how much of it's tricep, how much of it's pec, how much of it is front delt. You don't know. When you start isolating a muscle down more, you can determine how much of the progressive overload is coming from a given muscle. It allows for better programming. It allows for tests to see where you're at. In other words, if you really want to test the strength of a muscle, of a specific muscle, whether it's the quadricep or the tricep or the bicep, attempting to isolate it even in a machine is actually the best test to see how much stronger that specific muscle has gotten, because you've removed other muscles from the equation largely, and you've removed like motor unit learning and motor patterns. You've removed all of that stuff. So we're down to hypertrophy. And when you remove those other components, hypertrophy is basically the only pathway through which you can make a muscle generally stronger to any significant degree over time, when it's locked in place and there's no skill component to it. So there is that. Now, the argument could be made in the other direction for the looser form, because it's a compound movement. Compound movements generally improve strength even in the smaller muscles more. Like, that's been looked at in studies. Even in the short term, when hypertrophy is equal, if you cause the same amount of hypertrophy in a quadricep from a leg extension versus a squat, and then you test the leg extension strength, multiple studies have confirmed that even though the growth might be similar, the squat will actually increase the leg extension strength more than the leg extension will. So when it comes to long-term outcomes, movements that are bigger, that are multi-joint like that, even if it's using a little bit of body English to turn it into a slightly more compound movement, may have more potential for strength. And if they have more potential for strength, they have more potential for training and long-term overload for long-term strength outcomes. So there's no actual real benefit to isolating the muscle in that regard. If anything, using slightly looser form or using a compound variation of the movement. And what do I mean by that? How about, again, a curl where you bring the shoulder up also? Well, that actually has one of the other functions to one head, and insertion of the bicep does involve that rotation of the shoulder. And by adding that in, you actually may be more thoroughly working the bicep, in addition to turning it into a compound movement that might have a little bit of motor unit learning, which you can train for longer periods of time without stalling, at least in theory. So physiologically, there's an advantage to that, but it's harder to track. It's harder to program for once you start adding body English and a little bit of cheating and things like that. That's where we run into problems. So if you were to ask which one is better, you really can't say. There's a strong argument to be made for either one. There's a strong argument to be made for either one. Me personally, with a strength athlete background, I would tend to lean in the direction of slightly looser form on an exercise. In other words, using a variation of an exercise that either turns it into a multi-joint movement, even if it's a really small movement, or one that allows for a little bit of body English, and in that way, you're using other muscles to help move it, and then you're just worrying about maybe the eccentric loading a little bit more to cause additional hypertrophy, because that's what ends up happening when you use body English. You're relying a little more on the eccentric part of the rep to possibly add some muscle. But again, you're making it possibly more useful because you're bringing more muscles in, and there's no such thing as too much muscle involvement on an exercise. But that's my perspective looking at it from a strength athlete background. But the argument could be made that the stricter form for certain people for programming purposes and tracking purposes still might be superior. So you know what, it comes down to some personal preference there, and I don't think that there's an absolute answer on that one. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.